Welcome back to the show. I'm Anushan Selvaraja. Now we take a look at the economy, and joining me is Trisha Peries, the Product Head for Economic Research from Frontier Research. Welcome to the show, Trisha. Now, the central bank recently cut its policy rates. Now, what was the rationale behind this?
Okay. So since the start of this year, treasury bill rates have been falling. So they introduced a couple of SRR cuts that we saw in November as well as February of this year to inject liquidity and saw these rates coming off. But market deposit and lending rates weren't really coming off. So this was mainly one of the reasons for the central bank to really introduce this deposit rate cap, as well as the policy rate cut which we saw in May. Of course, a lot of it was to stimulate growth as well, coming off a very low growth year last year, and of course the impact of the Easter Sunday attacks on this year to dampen the growth prospects really accelerated probably the process of them continuing with an easing monetary policy stance.
Trisha, what are the global factors which could have contributed to this decision?
So global concerns was of course one of the major factors, and it was highlighted by the central bank as well. Global growth being the main concern. So of course in the US as well, with the US-China trade war conditions really not dying off, there's a lot of prospects of global growth slowing down. So a lot of the major central banks, US, Europe, England, Japan, most of them are on sort of an easing monetary policy stance at the moment, and this is quite different to what we were seeing last year. So last year the Fed was really on a tightening stance the last couple of years. And they've taken a change in tone. In fact, just this week in the July FOMC statement, they had cut their rates for the first time in the last couple of years. Of course, they've worded it as like a mid-cycle adjustment rather than getting into a rates cutting cycle. But it overall shows that there could be a weakness in the dollar, which is of course favorable for countries like Sri Lanka and gives us the breathing space to really cut rates, even if our real interest rates drop, that we wouldn't see a big impact in terms of foreign flows.
How do you see monetary policy shaping up moving forward?
So in the future, we could see the CBSL continuing on an easing monetary policy stance, but of course, we might not see it in terms of action very quickly. So of course, they're putting a lot of pressure on banks. They're talking about lending rate cap that could come in as well. But the governor has been very cautious. So he's really taking into account the fact that we could see a little bit more fiscal stimulus that could come from spending ahead of the elections. He's talked about the Gamperlia program, things like that could boost the economy. So it might not be needed to see rate cuts in terms of the monetary policy side as well. So he's really taking into account all of this. He's also mentioned that he's watching global markets quite closely because it's very easy to really turn quite quickly. So he doesn't want to act too hastily. So he might talk about more easing, but the action of it might come a little bit later.
Thank you very much for joining us, Trisha.
Thank you.
That was Product Head for Economic Research from Frontier Research, Trisha Peries. Thank you for watching Benchmark, and we hope to see you again next time.